Hi, I'm Liz Hamson, editor of Property Week, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Rhodes, head of Mishcon Purpose at Mishcon de Reya, one of our partners in the Climate Crisis Challenge. Alex was appointed in April 2020 to head up what is the first purpose-oriented business to be established by a major law firm. Mishcon says the new offering reflects the firm's view that sustainability is now a central issue for business and society. And the launch of Mishcon Purpose coincided with the firm's drive to improve the sustainability of its own business, including a commitment to be net carbon zero from this year on. Both commitments underline the seismic change that has occurred in corporate governance since August 2019, when the Business Roundtable, a traditionally conservative US lobby group comprising 200 of the biggest US companies, issued a statement on the purpose of corporation. In that statement, they stepped away from the guiding principle of shareholder primacy and argued that companies should no longer advance only the interests of shareholders. They should also invest in their employees, protect the environment, and deal fairly and ethically with their suppliers. It was a watershed moment. And now, despite the ongoing challenges posed by the pandemic, ESG factors continue to transform how companies and investors think about risk. And corporate governance standards continue to evolve to meet the growing demand for greater accountability and transparency. It's also becoming increasingly important for boards to ensure that companies operate under a clearly articulated corporate purpose. Alex, across the world of business, there seems to have been a real shift towards embedding ESG values within corporate governance. Building value by simply pursuing the bottom line is no longer seen as sustainable for businesses or the planet. What, in your view, is driving this shift, and how is it manifesting itself?
Thanks, Liz. I think at its base is a realization that we're facing existential threats to our way of life, like climate change, for example, like growing inequality, and that these can't be addressed by governments alone. In terms of leadership, in terms of capital allocation, behaviour change and collective international effort, businesses have a really important role to play in this. As you say, this has been recognised by business leaders. For example, the decision by the Business Roundtable to focus on purpose and a wider remit for the purpose of business. And that's not just because, of course, it's good for society and for the planet, but it's also because it's good for business. It's interesting that commitment was made by CEOs of some of the biggest companies. And I mean, in the real estate space, some of the giants like CBRE, Cushman & Wakefield, Turner Construction, in terms of property owners, Target, Walmart, the Carlyle Group, and others. And the reason that they've done this is because it drives value. And that has been borne out during the pandemic, whether one's looking at the performance of ESG-related funds against their competitors or their counterparts, where they have held up to be more resilient and to hold better price and to be better placed to recover after it. It's looking beyond short-term returns to that longer-term value seems to be fundamental.
And you think that change is going to stick, and people are going to continue to pursue that agenda and not be derailed by more immediate challenges, notably COVID-19?
I think so, and it's being borne out by what's happening and the commitments that are made. Of course, as you're right to point out, that the Business Roundtable commitment was made before the pandemic broke around our ears. But if we look at the way that the pandemic has focused people, of course, there's been an immediate focus on human health. And everything that has entailed. And within business, if one's thinking about ESG, the environmental, social and governance aspects, there has of course been a huge focus on the S, on the social part, in particular around workforce. How have businesses responded by looking after their workforce, or indeed not looking after their workforce? And how have they worked with communities that they serve? Have they pivoted to try to help address the challenges that COVID has brought up? But all of the conversations certainly we're having have borne out that actually the pandemic has crystallized an awareness and a focus of the fragility of the systems that we're working in, and that climate in particular has to be focused on.
I think it's that broader concept of value that's come to the fore, hasn't it? And actually, in many ways, the pandemic has brought that to the fore. So how are you seeing that manifest itself then in boardrooms?
I think in terms of challenges, probably the first is at boardrooms, and in terms of boardroom understanding of this type of risk. ESG risks come from within. They're different from the classic risks that boards are good at spotting and dealing with, which are 3 to 5 year time horizon, external risks, the icebergs that the boat might hit or the other way. ESG risks come out of the way that you decide to run your business. And so they need a slightly different approach and understanding. And with that, a slightly different time horizon. Because they are to do with the way that you run the business, therefore they're to do with your corporate governance, but they're also to do with your corporate culture and your priorities. And so necessarily one's looking at a longer time horizon. So the first challenge for boards is really to change the way that they start thinking about risk, and particularly with these risks. And for example, in our business, how do we properly deal with climate change risk? Are we properly footprinting our carbon emissions? Are we setting science-based targets, which will mean that our business is on track to a 1.5 degree warming in the world's temperature, or are we not? And if we're not doing that, then are we contributing towards the problem? Is a really pertinent question that boards are trying to address. Similarly,
and there are no straightforward answers, are there? I mean, so you've talked about that as the first challenge. Is that also the biggest challenge, or is there another challenge that's bigger than the risk piece?
Well, I think the first challenge I think is understanding at a board level. I think the second challenge at a board level is materiality. Trying to work out what's really material. There is this nebulous big cloud of developing risk out there under ESG, whether it's climate, whether it's diversity and inclusion, which of course I know is something that you've written plenty about. How do we prioritize within our business? Because if we try to do everything, we're not going to do our business. And so it's that question of sort of working out what is material and what is not, and how to prioritize on that. And I think that's the second really big challenge for boards. And of course, that's why we set up Mishcon Purpose, in our business, to help boards have those conversations, and to help them have those conversations confidently and openly, because unless they really grasp the nettle on these things, there's no point in going about it.
And what avenues do you think are available for companies who want to address ESG risk within their business but are not really sure where to start?
One of the frameworks, which isn't real estate focused, but is specifically designed for businesses, is a framework called B Corp, which is something that we're a great fan of at Mishcon de Reya. It came to the UK from the US about 5 years ago, and we've been supporting businesses that want to become B Corps by partnering with B Lab UK, which is the UK charity that supports it. B Corp is a certification, if you like, of responsible business, But to get that certification, there are a couple of things you have to do. And one is...
A bit more than a couple. It's a really challenging sort of certification to acquire, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But the fundamentals of it are really very straightforward, and they sit on all fours with this change of purpose, or this broader view of purpose. The first thing that the business needs to commit to is to what they call a legal change. It's to changing the constitution of your company to back up that change in your purpose. So you remove shareholder primacy and you say, we acknowledge the directors need to run the business not only for the benefit of the shareholders, but equally, i.e. in equal weight, for the benefit of society and the environment. And that's a really fundamental change, and it's obviously a legally binding one. The second part behind that change is then actually how you implement it. And the B Corp run a thing called the impact assessment, where you go through, as you say, a painstaking process, turning every rock in your business over, and you assess yourself. And it's an independent framework for responsible business. It allows you to bench yourself against peers. And interestingly, going to your earlier question about, how has the pandemic affected this whole agenda? We have had a flood of companies coming to us saying, can you help us with this process? Can you help us through this process and all of the aspects that sit around it?
And more than you would have expected before the pandemic, or do you think it's accelerated?
There's no question that the pandemic has accelerated it.
That's really interesting and really a positive outcome, isn't it, from a very sort of negative situation, really. What about, so that's the sort of short-term impact of COVID on the ESG and sustainability agenda. Looking a little bit further ahead, what do you think's coming down the line?
We live in an uncertain world, don't we? In a way that I think we've never felt that we have before. I think that we're going to see not only a speeding up of the ESG agenda in terms of how it bites on businesses, both in terms of public calls for accountability and through the financial sector in terms of the way that they allocate capital. It's very interesting if you look at the task force for climate-related financial disclosures, which the FSB initiated, focusing again on carbon, but on capital allocation within businesses, where the investment community said, hang on a minute, are we carrying the can here? If capital has been misallocated and hasn't taken account for where climate change is going to impact on the values of the businesses that we're investing in, then why should we carry that? And they're requiring the businesses that they invest in to report on their climate-related financial risks. And I think we're going to see that approach rolling out, where accountability really sits at the doorstep of businesses.
I hope to see that, yes. And what do you think the key drivers are for boards in terms of embedding these ESG values?
There are probably, you can cut it in a number of ways. I think there are probably 5 proximate ones. Reputation. You don't want to be an irresponsible business. And that's both, I think, comparative with your peer group and absolute. I think the increasing calls for accountability that we mentioned, whether that is, one looks at Extinction Rebellion and the protests off the back of that, whether one looks at Black Lives Matters, and that you've again so eloquently written about in Property Week, and what that call for accountability means. We've talked about increasing investor demands, but I think also just within the community, within the business community, but also within the real estate community, a raising of the floor for corporate governance and standards. that there is a raising of what is expected generally by business, and it's that combination of the raising of the floor and the raising of the ceiling, if you like, at the same time that I think is really escalating the change. And of course, coming in together with these and really following the standards that have been driven are legislative and regulatory changes.
I mean, there's definitely a bit of push in there as well, but I think it has become much more aspirational, hasn't it, across businesses? And what, in your view, are the three most important ESG issues that the real estate should be focusing on right now?
I think carbon is absolutely fundamental, and grasping it properly. And there are great initiatives going on within the industry. The Better Buildings Partnership, for example, where 25 of the UK's largest real estate companies have pledged to establish a climate change commitment. And importantly, as part of that, to go to the sort of accountability piece, to publish their own framework for a net zero pathway. And I think, you know, if you look at what's come out of Property Week's Climate Crisis Challenge survey, which is really interesting, to your point of where the pull and the push is. You know, I think 60% of the respondents to that said that they had a business strategy for addressing climate change, and over 80% said that they understood the role that they could play. You know, for a sector which generates 40% of emissions, that's really heartening.
And I don't think if you'd asked those questions a few years ago, you'd have had those sorts of responses, would you? Did you give me three though? You got carbon?
I gave you one. I mean, I think that the other two that I was going to mention were engaging properly with the process. And that goes to reputation. I was speaking yesterday with Alexandra Muzavadier from Tortoise Media, and she has established a thing called the Responsibility 100 Index, which is really interesting. And it looks at the FTSE, and it ranks the FTSE by two measures: walk and talk, in response to responsible business. And I think that just sort of underpins the focus on actually not only making commitments and the importance to making those commitments, but then actually delivering on them. And the really interesting thing that she was saying yesterday, because that whole index is based on publicly available information, was that the conversations, and she's had some quite tricky conversations, I think, with some of those companies as she's been ranking them, is that she's been saying you have to not only set your targets and move towards them, but you have to do so publicly. And I think that's a really important thing that businesses need to do. The third of the three things, because you asked me for three and I will deliver three,
Thank you so much.
Is that this is a team game. And I think it's all about partnerships. And I think, you know, what Property Week is driving with this initiative absolutely underlines that. And I think where you see businesses coming together in various fora, whether it's the World Economic Forum, whether it's elsewhere, shows that it needs to be a team effort. It's interesting when one looks at competition law, you know, which exists to prevent another public ill of anti-competitive behaviour. The regulators in Europe, and the Dutch are ahead of everyone on this, but the British authority has been focusing on it too. Have been saying we will be thinking about how we apply competition law where businesses are working together to try to address sustainability challenges. And so it's that. How do you work together with others? And I think in real estate, the opportunity is both vertically and horizontally. And there are interesting things coming out of the COVID situation, where I think that some of these things that are practically difficult can be grasped. And something we've been talking about is where landlords and tenants are coming together to review their lease terms, because of the financial stress coming out of the financial the pandemic, where offices aren't being used, for example. Do you have service businesses having conversations about, well, hang on a minute, should we change our terms to look at some kind of profit-related lease instead of a standard terms lease or whatever? But these conversations are going on, and that creates a space for a conversation around, well, how do we share information about how that office space is used? Because on a practical level, one of the big stumbling blocks, I think, has always been between landlords and tenants, where does the responsibility sit, and how does that information get shared so that people can actually then incorporate that into their planning and their delivery?
Listen, thanks ever so much, Alex, for sharing your thoughts on what the industry needs to do to rise to the climate crisis challenge. Let's hope it does focus on those three issues, and that by COP26 in November 2021, real progress is being made, and a lot of the bold statements that we've been hearing have evolved into tangible and meaningful actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.